time to get started. And I'm Sherry Gilmore. I'm the Vice President of the Bastrop Historical Society. And I wanted to remind everyone, I know y'all have heard this before, most of you, that the mission of the Bastrop County Historical Society is to preserve and promote the history of Bastrop County. So in keeping with our mission, we have a super interesting program on tap tonight from our speaker, Brad Weber, with support from his wife, Ilona. Where are you, Ilona? She's at the back. Hello. And before we get started, I wanted to just let you all know that we do have a special guest tonight. Sylvia Carrillo is Bastrop's new city manager.
Amazing pool. I just found. I'm gonna hang out here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Brad Weber is a Camp Swift historian. He has a master's degree in military history and served in the United States Navy Reserve. He's a life member of the American Legion and also a research volunteer here at the museum. His particular area of research is World War I and World War II history, with a local emphasis on Camp Swift and the German POW camp there. So we are really excited to have your presentation, Brad, and so welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Glad to be with you tonight. I'll talk hopefully loud enough. If everybody in the back, you can't hear this big mouth enough, just thumbs up, okay? Turn the volume. Glad to be with you. I'll just kind of a little bit to piggyback on Sherry's introduction there. We moved here about a year ago, and kind of my interest with Camp Swift was almost coinciding with moving to the area. Didn't really have a whole lot of knowledge as far as the immensity of Camp Swift, much less that we had a German POW camp out there as well. So kind of fueled an interest, and one of the first things my wife said when we moved here was, get involved with the museum. Go up there and volunteer. Just get out of the house, leave me alone, I got everything to do. Go up there. There's all sorts of stuff to play with. So fortunately, the nice, wonderful folks down there, and Tracy and John and Carol, have been just wonderful to go down and spend time with and help foster my interest in the German POW camp. And that's going to be kind of the main of this talk. This is going to be the main thrust, is talking about the camp. And kind of the way I want to explain this is also kind of intermix a little bit of my journey with the research with this, kind of give you a little bit of the historical background about it, some anecdotes along the way, and then kind of give you an idea of what it's like today and some things that are happening with the research on this that I've been doing. So hopefully I kind of take you full circle. So that's kind of the goal. But anyway, kind of do a start here and kind of give you a little bit of, start with a little bit of background. So when the war started, we all hear about December 7th, 1941, and of course America's brought into this conflict. By this point in time, the Germans have run rampant across Europe and are threatening Britain. Their Axis allies, the Italians in the Mediterranean, are trying to take more territory in North Africa and basically kind of cut off the Suez Canal for Allied shipping traffic through there, so they can basically command the Mediterranean Sea. So kind of with the Italians starting this conflict in North Africa, they kind of quickly found they were in trouble with the British. And so they called upon their friends, the Germans, and Adolf Hitler, to come to their rescue and try to push the British out of there. So that's where the Africa Corps from Germany comes into play. It's mainly a lot of soldiers from the Russian front that are intermingled into the Africa Corps. So they're getting some very seasoned soldiers and kind of get a renown for themselves as the war progresses. General Rommel, some of you may have heard of him. He was one of Hitler's favorite generals at the time, and so he was put in charge of the Africa Corps, and his nickname was the Desert Fox. So he's basically leading the fight against the British, and that's where the United States comes into play. After we're into the war, we're looking at a place to get involved. And at the time, the American leadership did not want to do a head-on assault onto the main European continent, and decided that Africa would be the place where we start at. So essentially, Africa becomes kind of our first introduction into the war and the first time we're coming up to bat against the Germans in conflict. So General Patton, as you probably have heard all about him as well, is one of our main leaders that's leading this attack. And so ultimately was successful in being able to get the Germans corralled, and as the conflict went on, they were basically unable to keep reinforcing the Africa Corps. They were stealing vehicles from the British and Americans, whatever they could scrounge up and keep going with. This kind of how they kept this battle going. And eventually they were forced to capitulate. So that brings us to a problem. What do we do with all of these prisoners? So our allies, the British, are basically going to be our staging point to start a conflict in Europe. And so they're going to have to absorb a lot of American forces there as the springboard, so they don't have the capacity and room to house all of these prisoners. So the solution was to send these prisoners by ship both to Canada and to the United States. And so basically, at the time, you've heard of the U-boats, I'm sure, and kind of the worry about the traffic going back and forth from America to the European continent and trying to navigate through these waters. Basically, they try to put it out to the U-boats and Germany that we're going to be transporting prisoners, so you might not want to sink this boat. So that's kind of the way we start in getting these prisoners from one place to the next. One of the things that was very important to the Americans, particularly, was following the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention was basically an agreement of several powers that they would agree to certain terms of how you treat prisoners, what you can't do. That's the playbook we're going to play by. So the Americans made it very much a top priority that we're going to abide by this, and that's how we're going to respond and treat these prisoners that we're taking into America. So one of the aspects of it is that they wanted to follow the Geneva Convention as far as putting prisoners that are captured in a particular location, like in this case Africa, into a climate that's somewhat similar to where they're being brought from. Texas was the natural place to put them at, since that's such a very similar climate, and that's the kind of gear they had, or shorts and t-shirts and things like this that they're coming with. So that's kind of what made Texas one of the forefront places in the United States for housing these prisoners. So as you can see kind of above me, just throwing out a few little stats here for you. So we have 150,000 men immediately that are coming over here in April of 1943. So average-wise, there's 20,000 people being brought and shoveled over each month. This increased a little bit more too with the Normandy invasion. Again, we're still bringing them across, even though some of these other battles start taking place later on in the war. So pretty close to 500,000 prisoners are here by the end of the war. Both German, Italian, and a little amount of Japanese prisoners were brought here as well. So kind of with the system that they had for prison camps, one of the things that they would do is have a base camp, and that means it's mainly a camp that's formed in conjunction with another military operation going on. So like for instance, that's Camp Swift. We're training American soldiers here. We already have this set aside, so they set up camps here to take in some prisoners. Kind of main camps are things like Camp Hearn. I don't know if some of you folks have heard about Camp Hearn. It's close to College Station. They have a great POW museum and program there. It talks a lot about this. But essentially that was just a dedicated base for POW labor that they had there. So that's kind of the middle point. The last kind of camp was called a branch camp. And these are things that were very, very small camps that were kind of sprinkled throughout Texas that were more work-related camps, much smaller, a lot of guards that are still there watching these prisoners, but it was really geared to the agricultural aspect, which we'll kind of get into in a second. Overhead, you can kind of see this map. Gives you a little bit of an idea. These are more of the military base camps that we're kind of looking at here. In all, we had about 70 camps by the end of the war in Texas, which was twice as many as anywhere else in the United States. So Camp Swift, you can see up there in our Bastrop County. And so kind of just like what I said, we have a couple of, twice as many camps as any other state. Started out with the 12 main camps, like what were typical here at Camp Swift, which blossomed to 33 by D-Day in 1944. So as you can see, this was the hot place. If you're into POW history, this is the place to be. So typically when they came overseas, they would dock mainly in Boston and New York. They would disembark the prisoners. They were given a certain amount of supplies that they were allowed to bring with them. Some things were confiscated, things like helmets, their medals, anything that's a war material was stripped from them. And so they were able to take what they could in a certain size bag and take that with them, and they were put on Pullman rail cars. And so they were just kind of fanned out to these various camps. And yes, you can see these Pullman cars look pretty snazzy for a lot of them. I've read a lot of POW accounts. They never had anything this nice in Europe. They couldn't believe.
They
Wow.
look sad.
Yeah, nobody looks pretty sad in this book. Yeah. So they're impressed, and I've read an account from one prisoner who was at Camp Hearn, Heino Erickson. He talks and wrote a book about his experience called Reluctant Warrior. It's a good read if you're interested in that kind of thing. I'll point that out. But he talks about coming in these Pullman cars and just being, you're looking out all around you as you're on your way to Texas, and you can't believe just how things look so serene and relaxed. They don't have all these blackouts, places bombed out wherever you go. It's just like it's a bustling society that looks like they're not at war at all, and they can't believe, how they landed in this place. So it's kind of an interesting impression they're getting as they're coming to these camps. This is an actual picture of Camp Swift, of the POW camp. So kind of underneath here, I was talking about the branch camps. So the branch camps were, as I said, kind of agriculture related. So there was rice harvest was a big thing, cotton harvest, vegetables, anything to do agricultural. People were hurting because of the servicemen being called up, and the boys are going overseas, so who's going to do all this farm work? POW labor was the answer to that. So, so these branch camps, I thought were kind of amazing that Camp Swift administered these camps. So these were basically prisoners kind of taken out of Camp Swift and put in Rosenberg, Alvin, Bay City, El Campo, and Eagle Lake. So kind of interesting. A few of these actually have historical markers near where the camps were as well. So if you're ever out traveling around, maybe something to be on the lookout for and find that marker there. But I think this was a real kind of interesting. This particular picture is capturing a POW funeral procession that's going through the soldiers. So you can kind of see on the one frame where they have the coffin that they're carrying on their backs and going through the main road there. So total 3,865 German POWs were housed at Camp Swift. About 9,000 processed through there during the war. Kind of underneath that, just to talk about that artifact, that's actually an armband that all Africa Corps soldiers had on their uniform. And basically that was the main group of people that were incarcerated at Camp Swift, were the Africa Corps prisoners. Had a couple of shots. We had, fortunately, as one of the nice discoveries I found downstairs, is that we had a German POW's family donate some pictures to the museum, to the archives. And so they had some pictures like this one that we're looking at here, and kind of get an idea of kind of what these guys look like, what their uniforms look like. Most of them, you'll see in some other pictures, always have PW painted on their backs, big letters, or on their pants. To identify them when they were out somewhere, that you knew that was a POW. One interesting article that I found kind of later on in the war, in the late 40s, in the late 44, 45 era, they actually had a newspaper article in the Bastrop Advertiser telling kids, stop painting PW on your clothing. Might give the wrong idea to some people. So a little warning there. But this is another shot that they had as well, and you can see a little bit more of that PW on their uniforms there. A lot of places like Hearn, for instance, a lot of these camps didn't always have the clothing necessary to give to these guys for work clothes. They were given a certain allotment of clothing materials and personal sundry items when they came into the camp, and they were given a bag to keep it in. Particular prisoners would be given old World War I American uniforms that had PW painted on that, because there was kind of a clothing textile shortage. You know, we're worried about getting our own guys outfitted properly for the war. So a lot of interesting little things like that you wouldn't think of. They're wearing a World War I American uniform in a POW camp. So pretty interesting. So in talking about the labor, basically the Geneva Convention, officers were not required to work or participate in any kind of work activity. So basically, any kind of enlisted men or non-com officers were the ones that could work. It wasn't mandatory that they had to, but if they chose to do so, they would give them 80 cents a day was the wage that they would be paid. And then they would be given these chits. You can see there's a denomination of 1 cent and 5 cent. They had 1, 5, and 10 cents and would come in booklets, and then they would issue these to the prisoners, and then they had a canteen or an exchange at the POW camp that they could go and purchase things. So candy, cigarettes, beer, whatever. You know, that book I had mentioned about Heino Erickson had talked about how some prisoners would kind of save up their beer coupons and kind of like do a little lottery system amongst themselves. So one guy could really get drunk at one time and he's not writing some coupons. So, but these are really kind of interesting. And I got a shot here, I'll show you here shortly too, of kind of what the canteen looked like. But this was kind of their main way of paying, and then they would get $1.50 for doing work. So if they chose to do it, gave them something to do. A lot of prisoners did choose to do it. They just like the excuse to be out and doing something. And you get a little pay in return for it as well. Camp Hearn, just kind of transport us over there for a second. One of the things that they had a little bit more of a harder time getting guys to want to do this kind of work. So the ones that were left around camp, they'd give them building materials, something to do to spruce up the place around the camp. So a lot of them would start building these elaborate water fountains and features to decorate around the camp barracks. And then they would, they had one that was like a big European castle from Germany that they had made a replica of. Another thing they did was they did their own petting zoo. So for instance, with the petting zoo, they would have possums that would wander into the camp. All sorts of little weird critters that they would throw out there, and that was their zoo. One of the funny stories that Heino mentions was they had saw this unusual black cat that had a white stripe on it. There's an interesting striping thing. And then they tried to bring him into the camp, and then that went really, really bad. So they knew to leave those alone. This is a little bit more of another example, kind of give you an idea of what these little chits look like and all their denominations. But I think it's just kind of fascinating to think about. They're neat little artifacts of that time period. This is a picture of what the exchange looks like. So you can kind of see on the shelves. I know it's kind of hard, probably far away from here, but all the prices underneath the shelves, candy bars, cigarettes like we're talking about, all shaving cream, all sorts of things like that. So whatever, they could go and purchase and use their chits for that and trade whatever they wanted to do with it. So it's kind of an interesting thing to see. And a lot of the folks would talk about criticizing these camps, calling them the Fritz Ritz. Boy, these guys have got their own PXs, they got their own food, they got their own, they really made a concerted effort to feed them, per the Geneva Convention, the same kind of food that we fed our own soldiers. And again, it kind of goes back to that concept. The president on down wanted to make sure that the way we treated the prisoners could have direct outcome for the ones of ours that were being incarcerated by the Germans or by the Japanese, and how they treated them. So there was a real concerted effort to be very fair, show the best side of our country at the same time. So anyhow, kind of going for activities, what about the guys that have downtime? What about the guys that didn't want to go work? So keeping them busy was a big priority. How do we keep them out of trouble and keeping them active in things? So soccer, being the big sport in Europe, was a great outlet. And this is actually a picture of one of the soccer teams at Camp Swift that played out here. I'll show you a picture of their field in a second, and it looks like Bastrop when you see it. You're like, oh, that's Bastrop. The other activities, a real interesting story. I'll talk more about this at the end, but I've actually met one of the assistant commanding officers' wives recently and touched base with her, and got to talk with her about some of her memories. And her husband, she had mentioned, basically it was a priority for him to keep these guys busy, keep them with something to do. A lot of the other problem cases, there were cases of people that were hardcore Nazis that were beating up the non-believers in some of these other camps, and it was always a kind of a hard time keeping them separated from each other and trying to keep that under control. So giving them something to do was a big priority. So he had told her, one day he had been doing an inspection at Camp Swift, came across this cot, turned the cot over, and the German soldier was sitting kind of down and kind of looking like very pensive and kind of anxious, like what's going to happen here as he turned this cot over. When he looked, he saw these portraits underneath of Madame Chiang Kai-shek and all these political and movie star figures that had been painted underneath his cot. So had an interpreter with him and asked the German soldier, like, how did you do this? And so he had walked around out in the yard, camp yard, and I found a stick, and then I took some of the canvas thread off my bedding and swirled it around the stick, and I went to the mess hall and I got a can of beet juice and I boiled some flowers to make the yellow, and I took some toothpaste and water to make the blue, and I painted that. So the other guy looking next to him was kind of also pensive, like, oh crap, I'm going to be in trouble here too. And so he was holding a figurine of a dog. He's like, how did you do that? Well, I took a butter knife out of the mess hall and just started carving on it. And so he looked to his wife and said, hey, go into Austin tomorrow, take one of the camp jeeps, go in there and get some art supplies for these guys. Go also to like any kind of a secondhand store. If there's something broken, if it's a radio, it's some kind of a little gizmo of some sort that needs repaired, pick it up and bring it and back with you. So she went and did that. And so by giving them these materials, the idea being keeping them busy, keeps them out of trouble, and giving them something to do and developing skills that a lot of them already had. In fact, one of the prisoners, by last name of Schindler, out there was actually an instructor at the University of Leipzig Art Academy. So there were some people here that really kind of knew what they were doing. So kind of dovetailing on the back of that, so there happened to be a court-martial going on of some prisoners of another camp that were accused of beating up other prisoners that was being held at Camp Swift. There was a big general that had come out that was participating, observing what was going on with that. So he went up, her name's Betty, by the way, that was the CO's wife, assistant CO's wife, and asked Betty, why is it that you don't seem to have these problems at Camp Swift like all these other places seem to be doing? She's like, she thought about it, she was a little scared that this bigwig general's talking to her, and well, let me show you something. So she walked him over to the mess hall, and in there they had a 24-foot mural that had been painted in there by the prisoners, and all this artwork lining around the building, and figurines kind of laid out. And so he's like, where did they get all this stuff from? How did they do this? And she's like, I'm gonna come clean. I took one of the Jeeps, and I'm not supposed to, but I went into town because Bob sent me there and I picked the stuff up and brought it back, So she thought, I'm probably gonna be in trouble, or I just got Bob in trouble after she said that. She's like, the general kind of was like, kind of pensive about it. He's like, so how many's escaped with using these tools? She's like, same amount that escaped before we had these tools. Nobody. They like being here because of this. So kind of walked away. She said 2 days later he found her and out there at the camp again. He's like, well, little lady, I just wanted to let you know I talked to your husband, and we paid him 80 cents a day to go do agricultural work. I'll pay him 80 cents a day to do this artwork, and if they can sell it in the PX, that's fine. So he kind of grinned and walked away, and she's like, good, I'm not in trouble. So I thought that was kind of an interesting story, but I think that's the key in addition to these activities of just giving them enough things to do, and then they don't have a desire to want to cause problems and what have you. This is another shot I was telling you about, and I think you can kind of agree, this looks like Bastrop. That's their soccer field that they played at. And it's kind of kind of a tribute, I think, to the officers that they had the wherewithal to think of these things. You know, when they come into the camp, again, she had shared with me that they would have a train that would station across from Camp Swift. Tracks kind of came up close by the camp. They disembarked and they brought them over to an auditorium. And that's kind of the foundation when I think that they really wanted to intentionally instill in them when they came there to set the tone for the rest of their incarceration. So she said, you know, Bob would take them over to a big auditorium, set them all down in there, and he had an interpreter that was a young Jewish boy from the Bronx in New York. And Bob didn't know any German, they didn't know any English, so this boy played a critical role, and he's like, but I'm Jewish, I think they're gonna hate me. And he's like, don't worry about it, you know, put him at ease, you know, and just say what I say. All right. They set them all down in this auditorium, and she said, you know, first thing Bob would say was, welcome to America. And so she would wait for the translation, you know, and basically they had so many different dozens of dialects that all these different translations are all murmuring in the crowd as they're all translating to each other what he's saying. So the next thing he said was, we're all victims. You're a victim of this war, and I'm a victim of this war. I didn't start it, you didn't start it, but we're all here together now. And so I will treat you with respect. I'm not going to cuss at you, I'm not going to hit you, I'm not going to beat you. If you can show me the same in return, I think we'll have a successful time. Can you do that? There was a pause as all that translating, murmuring was going on again, and then she said they in unison all jumped up, stuck out their right arms and said, Jawohl! So, like, good to know. So that was kind of sets the tone. So I guess when you think of it in conjunction with taking them all through these work activities and downtimes, again, the key is always keep them busy, and they really didn't have those kind of problems. I think it's a tribute to them. And another thing they had was an orchestra of their own, so they were given musical instruments and perform music out there. Camp Hearn has a couple of really good stories too. I don't want to tell you all the stories because I want you to actually go there and check this stuff out. But some interesting stories about their orchestra. I'll just leave it as a teaser and go check it out sometime. But this is a copy of the inside of the mess hall. So this gives you a little bit of an idea too of kind of what the interior looked like. A little bit of decoration and whatnot going on in there, but you know, again, nobody looks unhappy in these pictures. Everybody looks pretty well satisfied and content where they're at here. The food is another interesting thing. So as I had mentioned earlier, food being comparable to what our soldiers were being fed was a primary goal of the Geneva Convention. So the Americans paid a lot of attention to this. This caused a lot of rancor with the American citizens. Things were in short supply. People had ration books to be able to get so much flour, to get so much, sundry items and stock your house with it. And it seemed as if these German prisoners seemed to get the best of everything all the time. It's like, what's going on here? And there was a lot of back and forth with people complaining to the American leadership about how they were being fed. In this particular picture, you can see them baking bread here at the Camp Swift mess hall. That bread looks pretty good. I've been to Europe and I know how good it is, so I can only imagine how good this stuff was. Betty had told me a story, so the Germans would cook for the officers out there at the camp. So she was telling me that one day they had come up with an interpreter and were kind of going around the table asking, kind of what kind of things would you like to eat. So Betty had said, I would like a fruit salad. That sounds really good. And so they were kind of like, fruit salad? Kind of looking at each other like, what? And she's like, it's like you cut up a lot of fruit and you put it in a big bowl and it's just kind of all mixed in there together and a little syrup or something in there with it. Okay, so they brought her the next day a great big bowl of fruit salad. So when they started looking at it, they couldn't figure out what these little red things were in the middle of these little red balls. They realized they were tomatoes. So it's a fruit, it's on a vine. So they threw them in there and everybody was picking through going, what were they thinking? They didn't want to offend them, and she's like, just blame it on me, just blame it on me. So they went ahead and, kind of, everybody had picked a side on their place, which was obviously came to pick it up. And nobody liked the tomatoes in there. She did give a really neat story about her birthday that they had made. She said it was the thinnest cake that you could ever imagine, just multiple layers, and it was a very, very small, very petite, something like you would find in a cafe somewhere, kind of quality cake that they made for her birthday. She's like, I'll never forget that. Yeah, kind of an interesting relationship that they had with the leadership out there. Letters home, big thing to do in the downtime. Some of the pictures you might recall of the group photos and soccer team and things like that. Periodically, Camp Swift would have a photographer that would come out, and it wasn't unique just to Camp Swift, by the way. I mean, a lot of camps did this, but they would periodically come out and take photo postcards for the prisoners to be able to send back to their families to kind of show them what kind of shape they're looking at, and let them know they're okay, kind of put them in this kind of a thing. So that was kind of like a little treat when that happened. I've collected a fair amount of these letters, and it's kind of interesting how many times that gets brought up that, oh, the photographer's coming out here soon. I'll have some pictures coming. You'll get to see what we look like here, And so it was kind of a big thing, I could tell, for the prisoners to be able to kind of give some reassurance to their families back home. But they had to go through a censorship process. You can see a lot of the stamps through there. You can see a swastika and eagle on one of those. It not only passed through American censors, but also had to pass through the German censors. It's interesting when you find a lot of these how they will redact out several lines. Anything that seemed a little controversial on one side, they would X out. Anything the other side didn't like, if it looked kind of very pro-American, they didn't want to give the idea that things were really good back there. So it was always a lot of times very mundane kind of information they're exchanging with their families just to let them know they're okay and complain, hey, I haven't got a letter in a long time. How about writing me? So that's kind of another interesting feature of the camp. This is the POW chapel, and this was built by the prisoners themselves. Assistant Commanding Officer Bob Scherer had some prisoners that had approached him saying, we'd like to have some kind of a chapel here and maybe a cemetery or something. There roughly were 13 prisoners that died in captivity while at Camp Swift. And so Bob let them have some guards and a couple of trucks, let them go out, follow these cedar trees all around, let them clear out what they could. And they didn't have a lot of really power tools and things of an industrial nature to make this with, but according to his wife Betty, she's like, the craftsmanship on it was astounding. The inside of the chapel, she said, and I'll give you a little picture of what it looked like. She's like, the woodwork, the carvings into the pews and the altar in front. She said there was all sorts of Bible verses in German and English all around the perimeters of the chapel. And she's like, it's just stunning, makes you almost cry kind of a thing to see what kind of detail and effort they went to put into this. She had mentioned that after they had got done completing the construction on it, she said, most European men are very stoic, don't like to show a lot of emotion, that literally would go up to her husband and fall to their knees and put their arms around his legs and just weep, thank you for letting us do this. So kind of another one of those things, it's an interesting environment you're creating that keeps them under control and gives them something positive, and they certainly responded to that over and over and over again. This is a little bit more of a close-up. That picture I showed you at the beginning of the funeral procession, this is part of that series. And kind of let you see kind of what that looked like. They did allow swastika flags to be put onto the coffins to the soldiers and gave them full military rights. The American leadership would lead a procession through the camp, out the gates, and then they had a bridge they would cross into the cemetery, and they had a honorary firing squad there that would shoot rounds and salute in the air to the prisoners being buried there. So Very fascinating and very interesting. This is a street where you can see them going down with that casket about halfway in the middle of that picture, and then the American officers leading the procession through the streets. This is the entrance to the POW cemetery. So as you can see, there's the iron cross over the entryway to it, and they built all of this work, bridges, fencing material, all that was built by the prisoners. I got a couple of other shots I threw in here for you as well, kind of see them going across this bridge and into the cemetery. And that certainly looks like Bastrop when you look at it. This was a cross that they put up in the cemetery, and as late as 1980s, I found an article in the paper that cross was still out there. They had disinterred the folks that were buried there and put them in Sam Houston National Cemetery in a special POW section. So kind of the remnants were left behind, but that still was standing all that time later. That's another shot kind of showing you the fence behind the back and some stones there are markers for the prisoners that were buried there. So that leads us to today. So just so happens, I've been so curious, I've been trying to figure out where in the heck was this camp at in Bastrop, Camp Swift. You know, all that was sold after the war, all the buildings for surplus, things got dispersed everywhere. There's just a little bit of that camp left. So what happened to all this stuff? Well, my wife and I had adopted a dog from the Humane Society out there at Camp Swift, and walking around, I had noticed there was a lot of foundations along the road as you're driving out there, and bricks, obvious foundations, things like that. And I'm like, that's got to be part of Camp Swift that's out here. So I credit her with giving the idea to check on the tax assessor side of Bastrop to see if we can get an overhead satellite view of what all this stuff is, where is it? So in doing that and kind of comparing that to some of the maps we had at Camp Swift downstairs, we were able, and I'm going to give her the credit for that, to kind of triangulate where that camp was. And so we took a drive out there, and this Corix Utilities energy company is out there on the actual site of the POW camp. So I went out and we saw there was all sorts of signs like, keep out, don't come in here, by appointment only. I'm like, oh, it's just right there. So we came out the next day, and I came out during their visitor hours, found someone there, and they were just like, welcome, yes, you are at the POW camp. And I'm like, wow. And they're like, we have pictures of the camp inside if you want to look. Well, yeah. So they showed me pictures, and I said, is it okay if I kind of just walk around a little bit and just kind of look at these foundations and things? I could see it on the map from the satellite, so I know it's out here somewhere. Like, oh, yeah. So I give them all the credit in the world, and for letting me kind of walk around out there. So this kind of gives you kind of what it looks like today out there, an idea. That's one of the foundations, really getting overgrown. I believe this was the mess hall that we looked at earlier, according to the gentleman out there. So that's the foundation for the mess hall. A couple of other buildings are out there. Kind of usually just looks like a little oasis of trees, kind of marks the spot where a lot of these foundations still are. I had asked them about the POW cemetery. I'm like, where exactly was that at? And they're like, well, if you kind of go out by the fence, you can kind of look through the fence and you can see it. We think that bridge is still there. So I walked out, and lo and behold, there's that bridge. Still there. And I was just like, wow, I can't believe that's still here. So pretty fascinating find. So after all of that, I did not think that my luck could get any better. And then I just happened to be downstairs at the library about a week and a half ago, and I happened to just be looking information online and come across an article on the AARP website talking about a lady that has something to do with Camp Swift, who's 99 years old. I'm like, got my interest up. So I read the article and found out Betty Scherer was the wife of the assistant commanding officer, Bob Scherer, at the POW camp here, and is still alive in Saginaw, Michigan. So I went home, I sat down, I wrote her a letter and introduced myself. Said, we have a very nice historical society here in Bastrop. Just want you to know that. And I'm really, really, really interested in this German POW stuff. And so I'd love to hear from you. 2 days later, I get a phone call from Saginaw, Michigan, I just loved your letter. And I'm like, so very nice conversation. Long story short, I'm going to meet her this weekend and travel there. And so I'm bringing the good tidings of the Bastrop Historical Society with me to her. And we're going to try to do it right. So hope, stay tuned. We'll maybe have another seminar down the road of what I find when I get there. But thank you so much. I hope I didn't go too long-winded on you all, but thank you for coming. I really do appreciate it.
A gift for you that, here they are.
Oh, I want the blue one. You get the pink one.
Thank you.
We really appreciate all the work you put into this presentation. It was very interesting. And I do have to say that I am retired from the school district here in the field of special education. And one of the first buildings that I worked in Bastrop was a barracks from Camp Swift that was on the Emile campus, the Emile Elementary campus. So that was too, we don't want to talk about how long ago. Thank you all for coming. There's still refreshments back there, so help yourselves, and we'll see you next time.
Great.
Sure, yeah, are there any questions?
Yeah. If anybody has something,
Yeah.
I'll keep,
Go ahead.
if I can answer. You're up. Yes, sir.
Would you go back to the first slide?
Sure. The very opening one?
Yes. There's a photograph of a POW with a line at the bottom of the photograph.
Yes.
Letters and numbers.
Yes.
Can you
There you go.
Put those things on?
Yeah. So each prisoner that was incarcerated would be given a special serial number. So they took the record, essentially, they did thumbprints, fingerprints of every prisoner. They had kind of a one sheet that they had this all on, and then they would do a front and a side picture. And they were given a unique number. This is this particular prisoner's number. So any type of the correspondence, like the letters you saw in there, they would always write their number next to their name on any of their correspondence. That was kind of how they were identified. Mainly after the war, I was very curious because we're kind of blessed to have one of these records downstairs that was donated by the family of this gentleman. And basically they were given after the war, each prisoner was given their record. They just took it with them. I kind of wondered if there was maybe something that was duplicated somewhere you could find. As far as when they got back to Germany, in Berlin, there's an archives there for German soldiers during the war. And so from what I understand, they do have some records there that these prisoners would turn in and are kept there at the archives. I had actually written to one of the museums over there to ask them, one of the folks there to say, can you find Camp Swift people? Is it cataloged that way? They're like, you kind of got to know the name, you got to know that number, and kind of know where they're from, and then fill out 4 forms and send it back to us, and we'll charge you so many 20 euros for each record you want. So anyway, that's kind of what happened and became a lot of these pictures, but you do find them every once in a while, and if you ever look through old newspapers, whenever somebody escaped, you would always have these pictures in the newspaper article that would go out in the area saying, look for these guys, they're out running around out there somewhere, this is what they look like, and that was always used to identify them for any escape situations. So, yeah.
When you visit the lady,
Uh-huh.
do you think she would be agreeable to a video recording of your conversation?
We've already been thinking about that and have a plan in place there. We're gonna try, I've done a audio recording with her, but I'm taking video equipment with me so we can also videotape it. And kind of what we're hoping to do is, her husband was kind of an amateur photographer, so I know he's got a very large, fairly sizable collection of pictures we took at the camp that are one of a kind, no one else has ever seen before. So I want to try to kind of get her looking at that, see if there's any memories kind of get spurred up as she's looking at it to kind of see, if we can capture on video kind of those little moments. So that's kind of one of the things we're going to try to do. Exactly. Yes.
I'm hoping I'm recalling correctly, but a couple years ago we had an exhibit here from Camp Swift, and my understanding was that because you know, they were treated so well that some of them wanted to stay. Did anybody get to stay under any circumstances?
It generally required a sponsorship from somebody stateside to sponsor them. Usually it could not, the rules were it couldn't be anybody in the military. So I think for good reason, you kind of think if these people have been over there fighting in the war, you don't want to kind of get them here a prisoner sponsoring. But if they had a sponsor, some of them would come back. I've actually found a couple of articles in the Bastrop newspaper archives in the 50s up until the 70s. Prisoners would come back with their families. A couple of the articles did talk about they were trying to get their citizenship and stay here. I found an article on one prisoner that became a pretty big physicist. Don't quote me on it. I think it was Stanford University is where he wound up at. It was kind of a big institution, and he was a former prisoner and came back to be an instructor here. So there's little stories like that I find here and there, but there was a lot that came in. Heino Erickson I referenced in the article. He moved to Houston, came back after the war, and they found this orphanage network to help place kids in homes all over the world that, it really did something pretty beautiful with his life, and coming back and starting this foundation with him and his wife, and lived here in Houston. I know he came back several times to Camp Hearn for special events and things like that over the years. So definitely there was a lot of that happened, and I think it's all tied back to what kind of experience we showed them here. In fact, I told Betty, I said, probably the thing that we always think about in military history is always about who shot the pivotal shot that won the battle, who won the war, who was the general that did this, who was the admiral that did that. You don't think of people that are here not using bullets, but you're literally winning the hearts and minds of your enemy and showing them what you're about. You show them what your system, how it works here. They know how theirs has turned out, but they're seeing how we operate here, and that impressed so many of them. There's so many stories of that trying to get your naturalization to come back and stay here that occurred. I think they were successful in doing that just because of that.
Yeah. And could you tell us the name of that book again? Yeah.
Reluctant Warrior.
Reluctant
Uh-huh.
Warrior. Okay.
Heino Erickson, individual. And you can call back too if you forget or don't remember or need spelling help. Call me and let me know.
Okay.
Did some of them work outside the camp?
They did, like some of those branch camps we were talking
I'm talking about the ones here.
Oh, talking about this one here. This one here, I don't know if this particular one on the screen up there did.
No, I'm sorry. Was there a process where they could work out in the county?
Right. They had a program where if there was paperwork that a farmer, rancher, somebody in the area, if you needed agricultural assistance on your farm or whatever your operation was, you could submit that paperwork and request POW labor. Again, you had to pay them a certain rate, and there were people here that did work. I don't know a lot of the names, and Ken, you may be more familiar with some of these names that I'm going to throw out, or this name I'm going to throw out, but Betty had told me about someone named Dick Short that was apparently some type of a rancher or farmer here in the area. And she said that he had requested POW labor. They had come out there and brought folks to work out in his farm and whatnot. And rice, I think, was one of the crops that was kind of one of the big crops in the area that they were involved with. And so they would get a lot of old feed bags and rice bags that this Dick Short got on his farm. And he had asked Betty, can you use these bags for anything? And Betty was quite the sewing maven. And so she's like, I'll take these bags. All had prints and things very unique on these bags. And so they would load them up in the car when they were out there with the prisoners doing their work at the end of the day, bring them into town. And Betty had said that there was only one sewing machine and you could rent for 2 hours in Bastrop. And so she would rub these bags in there to kind of cut out patterns and make clothing for the German kids. They would come in so they wouldn't be able to tell her, other than kind of motion gesture, like, I have a child about this size and about this big around. And so she would kind of take these measurements, cut up these bags that they took from the farms that they were working at, make clothing out of them, and they could ship them back to their families. And they were so grateful, to be able to do that. She said that because of that situation with the sewing machine in Bastrop, they actually had found an old, heavy, bulky sewing machine that was used for making shoes. These prisoners had found one and had got it polished up, cleaned up, got it all in working order, found a needle for it. And her name to the prisoners was Mrs. Lieutenant. So she was sitting one day in the mess hall, and these guys came in lugging, 4 prisoners were lugging this thing in, and they said, "We have something we want to give you." And so they had this sewing machine that they gave to her to use there at the camp. So PX gave her a spot there to put the machine in and let her kind of keep cranking out all these little articles for them. And she's like, they were so grateful, and they keep trying to give things to her and Bob. I'm like, "We can't accept this stuff from you, you know, we have to pay you something." And they're just like, "Give me a cigarette lighter then. Get a toy for my kid," you know, something like that to kind of pay them back for kind of the generosity. But kind of started from that whole agricultural thing.
So the work that, did they go, it was kind of an honor system, or did they have to go out with guards, or how did they do that?
They did go out with guards. There's a lot of stories that you read about guards being very lackadaisical, kind of, you know, just kind of sitting around under a tree, kind of having a little siesta and just let them do their thing.
But they would transport it back and forth?
But they would transport it back and forth.
So you would have to have a pretty good group of people to justify a guard?
Exactly.
Okay.
You'd have to have a pretty good detail. They very seldom just let them go. They never let them go out by themselves. There always had to be someone. Yeah, never had any escape issues where people would pick up and run off while they're out there doing that work detail.
Wasn't there a story at Camp Hearn where there was a prisoner that was out on work detail and legged it out of there?
Yes.
And then like 3 days later, they found him along the road with a sign saying, "Please take me back."
It was kind of like that. Somebody heard him walking down the road. He was singing all these German marching songs to himself as he's going down the road. Of course, that sticks out like a sore thumb. What's this guy doing here? But yeah.
There was a POW camp in my hometown, and I remember as a 5-year-old talking to the Lord because they were working across the street from my house. Excuse me. And I remember walking, talking. He was standing there with a submachine gun, and, you know, because that impressed a 5-year-old.
Oh yeah.
And,
Where'd you grow up?
Yeah. Where was this?
St. Augustine. And
Okay.
those smaller camps there.
Yeah.
And but I remember that. This is where.
Wow. That would, yeah.
Wasn't Camp Swift used as a staging area after the war for the remains of the soldiers that died in Texas?
American soldiers?
Yeah.
I don't know. I hadn't heard that. Not saying what happened there, but.
The reason why I had her father was killed in World War II, and
Okay.
my mother, she's dead now, but he
Mhm.
said that his body was sent to Camp Swift.
Interesting. Really, I've kind of got a little bit of a side project going on. I've always got a side project going on. But I've got one where I've been trying to go through a lot of the death certificates in Bastrop County for Camp Swift and trying to kind of catalog people that died while they were here. It includes not only German POWs, we had certificates for them too. Also had American soldiers too. It's kind of fascinating. You kind of see a lot of the different causes of death in a lot of these records. You're kind of surprised on some things, you know, you see a lot of suicides occurred at the camp, which is kind of surprising to me. A lot of accidents with hand grenades over and over again, a lot of explosion deaths, auto accidents. A lot of times it's just out, you know, on leave somewhere or what have you, a lot of auto accident things like that. So it's kind of interesting in a sense, kind of a grisly interest, but you know, I just kind of was curious how many, and it's kind of amazing how many did pass through there and died while at the camp. Anybody else?
Thank you very much.